G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. As those of you who've been paying attention to my channel will already know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about batteries over the years. Lead acid storage batteries. I first started messing around with lead acid batteries to store electricity back in 1985, 86, when I was trying to build an electric wind turbine worth having. My fascination was with the turbine rotor blades, being more or less entirely concerned with the spinning bit. And originally I thought I'd just use automotive batteries, and initially I just went and bought a great big truck battery. I was told it wouldn't work, but I didn't believe it, and I paired that with a heavy duty industrial fast charging battery charger and a petrol powered electric generator, and it only took me about 2 weeks, maybe a month, to completely destroy that first battery. That was my first experience of the rules of lead acid battery storage of electricity, and these rules are pretty simple. The battery, for maximum performance, for the longest working life, the battery has some requirements. These requirements are as follows. Thou shalt not discharge the battery below having used 10% of its rated capacity. So if you want to use 10 amp hours, you get a 100 amp hour battery. And the battery thus goes from 100% charged to 90% charged, 100% charged to 90% charged. Also, thou shalt not discharge the battery at a rate exceeding 10% of its rated capacity. So you really should not take your 100 amp hour battery and discharge it at a 20 amp rate for half an hour in order to do that daily 10 amp hour cycle. Otherwise, the speed of the current going from the electrolyte to the plates will heat the apparatus to the point where you thermally shock the plates and they expand unevenly and they warp. Thou shalt not charge at more than 10% of the rated capacity in terms of charging rate. So you won't apply a 20 amp current to your 100 amp hour battery when it's 10 amp hours down. If you stay within those limits, you can expect 20 years working life from your lead acid storage battery, assuming that you regularly monitor the electrolyte level and use distilled water to top up the electrolyte level to replace the Brown's gas, which has electrolytically bubbled off during recharging. 20 years. That's not bad. But running on a 10% cycle means you have to have a very big battery to use a little bit of current. To do a small segue, dealing with people who make a business out of selling solar electric standalone systems, they compete with each other on price, and one of the simplest methods of marketing a low-cost standalone solar system is to skimp on the batteries, design the system so that if they've got clear blue sky days and a great big solar array, a relatively small battery will get them through the night, but they may be cycling the battery at 20% or 30% of its rated capacity. If you're cycling your battery at 20% of your rated capacity, you'll get 10 years out of it instead of 20. If you're cycling it at 30%, you'll be lucky to get 5 or 7 years out of it. When the battery is beyond useful operations, it becomes tender. Now, a tender battery is one that looks as if it's got a relatively good resting voltage. As soon as you apply a load, the voltage drops away to nearly nothing. As soon as you apply a charge, the charge resistance drives the voltage right up to the point where the regulator says, no, I can't fit any more current in this battery, and the battery has become unchargeable, unusable. My humble little abode has evolved over the years. About 20 years ago, 22 years ago perhaps, I had one generator, I had one battery charger, I had one inverter, I had one 120 amp hour 12 volt deep cycle battery, and that there is a 30 watt solar panel on a little wooden tripod, and it enabled me to use lights in the hut running 240 volt current from the inverter in the pyramid, and the generator used to live here too. The theory being that I could run 240 volts to the hut with less loss of power through voltage line drop than if I tried to run 12 volts to the house. And if you put the batteries right up against the wall of the house so that you can run the house on 12 volts, then that means you have to have your generator right up beside your house, and that means that it's louder. So therefore, I put 15 yards or so between the power shack and the hut. Now, the original setup in 1985 or so, that only lasted a couple of years. I did at one point buy a pair of 6 volt deep cycle storage batteries. This is a 12 volt deep cycle storage battery. That's a 12 volt automotive battery. And I've come to understand the difference between automotive batteries, which are designed for cold cranking amps, and deep cycle batteries, which are designed to be cycled up in the top 20%, but they're also designed so that you can charge them heavily. They're designed so that if they have been discharged 10, 20, 30%, 50% even, and then left flat for a while, you can, without immediately killing the battery, you can charge it to a high enough voltage that the lead sulfide, which has turned into lead sulfate and has covered the lead plates, thus blocking the flow of electrons from the electrolyte to the lead plates. That lead sulfate can be thermally shocked off the underlying lead plate, and a deep cycle storage battery not only has thicker lead so that you can do this repeatedly over the battery's lifetime, it has deeper sludge traps at the bottom of each cell so that the little flakes of broken lead sulfate fall down to the bottom of the sludge trap and they don't short circuit across the bottom of the plates, because a battery has interleaved positive plates, negative plates, all in the same electrolytic bath with a separator between each of them so that you can't get a short circuit across the plates. But if you get a automotive battery which has thinner lead on more plates in order to get more lead electrolyte surface area to get maximum cold cranking amps, it's not designed to be deep cycled, and a deep cycle is 10%. If you treat an automotive battery to a deep cycle lifestyle, you will pretty quickly go through all the lead on the plates and it'll just stop working, because underneath the lead there is a plastic mesh matrix onto which the sintered lead is hydraulically pressed. They used to make batteries out of solid lead, but A, it was expensive, and B, the extra mass made the batteries heavier, and C, lead isn't as structurally strong as plastic. So an automotive battery has a plastic core to the lead plates to allow dingle dangle, hydraulic shock, movement, bumps on the roads going uphill, downhill, emergency braking stops. Deep cycle batteries in a vehicle these days, they've also got a mesh core because lots of people have deep cycle batteries to run the fridge in their four-wheel drive. Anyway, that's that little bit of a segue on battery construction. Now, I have shown you the batteries that are in the pyramid at the moment. That's 4 225 amp hour 6 volt cells. They are half the batteries that came out of a golf cart. Because it's a small town, I can tell you that the golf cart was owned by a retired pharmacist and he used it a fair bit. They did 4 years in the golf cart and they've done 4 or 5 years here in the pyramid. These are a quarter of the batteries out of the golf cart. The other quarter of the batteries out of the golf cart, I didn't even bother bringing them home from the workshop. They went straight to the dump. Because in the golf cart, they get 8 of those 6 volt cells. They hook them up in series. So you've got a nominally 48 volt battery system. They charge them at 48 volts. So they probably go up to about 52 volts on their charger. And then the throttle has an electronic controller that regulates the current coming from the batteries going to the motor without just burning it away on a resistor. And the motors are 36 volt motors. So you can run your 48 volt battery way down before its voltage drops to 36 volts and your golf cart even starts to slow down. It means that the battery which is connected with its negative terminal going to the motor, that's the one that's getting sucked on the hardest. It's also the battery which is getting force fed the hardest because all of the current that goes to the very end battery in the string of 8 has to go through the first battery to get to the second, to get to the third, to get to the, because that's what happens when you get series wiring of batteries. So the first 2 batteries in the series, yep, they're absolutely shot. The next 2 batteries aren't too bad. The next 4 are quite serviceable. As you can see, I've got 4 or 5 years out of half the batteries in a golf cart. 4 6 volt cells connected us to 2 12 volt batteries, and those 12 volt batteries should have been originally 225 amp hours each. So I've got 450 amp hours worth of storage when new at 12 volts. What's actually happening is that the batteries are not new, they're old, they're degraded, they're not running, they're not able to hold a full charge. They've become a bit tender. Yesterday, 26 amp hours went in. There were some clouds in the middle of the day, but I hadn't used any more than probably 22 amp hours on the previous 24-hour cycle. They did reach what the controller calls float charge, which is where the controller says, I can't get any more power into you, I'm going to switch you off and let your voltage drop down, and then we'll try again later in the day. So they were fully charged last night. This morning, when I was pulling 2 amps at 8 o'clock in the morning, before the sun was on the panels, there was no current going in, they were showing 12 volts with a 2 amp drain. So I would say those batteries are now 50% degraded. They're usable in this situation, but if the apocalypse came tomorrow, I would be worried about batteries. So I decided I'll get myself some new batteries. I will splurge. I will go out there and not only will I get brand new batteries that have never done any time in a golf cart. So I'll start off with full complete 225 amp hour brand new batteries. But also, instead of an El Cheapo lashed up jury rig wiring system using alligator clips which corrode in the fumes and trapping bared copper wires for the wiring loom under the terminal nuts, and they corrode too, and suffering God only knows how much inefficiencies accumulating therefrom, I decided to bite the bullet. And what you're looking at there at a mere $250 at per each is 4 brand new deep cycle batteries. Here once again, you must permit a bit of a segue. Once upon a time back in the olden days, even when you were buying a automotive battery for your motor car, but particularly when you were buying deep cycle batteries, the batteries were manufactured in the factory and they were shipped, quote, dry. Your batteries would arrive and the cases would have the lead plates in them. They were fully assembled, and there would be plastic bottles of ready mixed battery electrolyte, which has a specific gravity of 1.3, according to all of the textbooks for 150 years. Lead acid battery electrolyte, sulfuric acid, 1.3 specific gravity. If you've got 1.3 specific gravity and a brand new battery and everything's perfect, each 2-volt cell will have a resting voltage of 2.2 volts. So your 12-volt battery, when it's full, holds 13.2 volts, because 2.2 times 6 equals 13.2. Okay. What that meant was that talked to your bloke at the service station. You told him you needed a new battery. He had a look in his catalogue or in his back room, and he said, yes, I've got one for your car. And he would say, I will fill it up now and put it on the trickle charger. It'll be ready by lunchtime. That's if you ring him up at 9 o'clock in the morning. If you got your deep cycle batteries, they would arrive and you would fill them up once you got them in situ. And then you would immediately put them on the charger. And then you would get your brand new battery. There's a specific gravity of 1.3 and it's holding its 13.2. And if you treat it with kid gloves, only cycle at 10% of its rated capacity. Don't overcharge it, don't undercharge it, don't fast discharge it. Don't let it sit there part flat. You're going to have 20 years out of it if you keep it topped up with clean electrolyte or clean sterile water, because when you charge it, it's only the hydrogen and the oxygen that goes out as gas. The acid stays in there and the electrolyte becomes more and more and more concentrated until you top it up. Therefore, you're supposed to keep topping it up regularly, not let the plates get air on them. However, 20 years ago, things began to change. Maybe 25 years ago. I'm getting old. What happened was more and more service stations were selling wet batteries. You could no longer ring up your service station and get them to fill the battery and put it on the charge for you. They'd say, oh, it's okay, we've got a battery ready to go, already full. And the wet battery's already full. They come with these little terminal protectors to prove to you that nobody has ever used this battery since it was manufactured. Isn't that marvelous? Doesn't that make you feel better as a customer? Well, if you're the sort of customer who doesn't know shit from biscuits about batteries, it probably does. But if you're the sort of customer who's buggered a few batteries before and therefore read up on them and learned a little bit about how batteries are supposed to work and what you're supposed to do to keep them friendly, those little red tags they're a danger warning. Warning, warning, Will Robinson. Do not proceed. Stop, check, look. Because what that protective cap means is that this battery has been filled up and nobody has ever charged it since. And every day that a battery is left connected to nothing, not charging, not discharging, it sulfates. And if it's got proper 1.3 specific gravity electrolyte, it sulfates at a rate of 1% of its stored charge per day. So what that means is that if it's been filled in South Australia, then by the time it's 30 days old, it will be maybe 60% of its rated charge, because every day it's got less stored charge, and it works its way down and down and down and down and down. It means that you can buy a brand new battery that's taken 3 weeks to get to you, and it's been pre-sulfated and pre-aged and pre-damaged before it ever goes into your car. And the first thing that your car's alternator will have to do is try and rescue charge the battery. Look at its voltage, hit it with a high current level, try and shock that sulfate off the plates to expose fresh lead so you can actually function as a battery. Then I noticed, again, 25 years ago, that the pre-mixed battery electrolyte was no longer 1.3 specific gravity. Oh no. Instead of 1.3 specific gravity, all the auto electricians in Glen Innes were being supplied, and I'm assuming Australia as well, because these were manufactured bottles, with 1.265 specific gravity. And what that means is that when it's left to sulfate, the battery loses 0.09 of a percent. Below that, 0.9 of 1% per day. So it sulfates slightly less every day. So it effectively has a longer shelf life. Effectively, what it means is that if you've got 1.3 specific gravity, you will be down at 70% at the end of 1 month, and then you're going to be down to 50% at the end of 2 months, and by that stage the battery is not going to last out its warranty period. With the watered down electrolyte, at the end of a month you're on 75%, at the end of 2 months you're on 60%, and you get a third month for it to sit on the shelves. So it's not as convenient for the customer because the batteries get effectively pre-aged. The more you live, or the further you live away from the factory, the more the batteries get pre-aged and the shorter their shelf life. However, as far as I can figure out, what changed was the insurance companies were having to pay out on the occasional times when service station operators told untrained staff to put electrolyte into a battery, and somebody who didn't know what they were doing, wasn't wearing gloves, wasn't wearing goggles, poured too fast, got an airlock in the battery, and they managed to blow sulfuric acid into their eyes. So it was a workers' compensation issue initially. The premiums being charged to service stations that filled batteries were much higher than those being charged to service stations which received and held and sold wet batteries. And you started to see small trucks, 5 or 10 tonne, getting around, closed-in trucks, covered with advertisements for the batteries they were selling, and they would have a regular routine run from, say, Tamworth to Armidale to Glen Innes to Tenterfield to Inverell to Moree, back to Tamworth, And all of the outlets would have their batteries on their shelf display replaced with new batteries. And the old ones, which had failed to sell after having been shipped to the far end of Australia, would then be shipped back to the factory, have the electrolyte poured out of them, the case dismantled, and they would be remanufactured. The lead would get melted down and pulled out of the, busted off the plastic and melted down, and they'd make a new one, which enabled the battery manufacturers to stand up with their hand on their heart and say, oh, for the purposes of saving the environment, 75% of our batteries comes from recycled material. Not because everybody was dutifully taking their old battery in to be recycled, but because maybe 60% of the batteries manufactured were shipped to the far end of Australia, never sold and shipped back. But the insurance companies were happy and the manufacturers had a good story to tell. Then, what is it, 20 years ago, 9/11? All of a sudden the regulators, the insecurity industry, began to worry about terrorism and improvised explosive devices and high-powered chemicals that the city's Henry couldn't be trusted to get their hands on. And there are some cultures where the men must have really tiny little dicks and they've got really low self-esteem. And anytime they are thwarted in the fields of love, they decide that their family honour requires them to throw battery acid in the face of the wife who told them that their dick was too little. Something like that. And because something like 50% of the people living in Australia today were not born here or their parents were not born here, suddenly we have a significant problem with little dick men throwing acid in the faces of their women folk for cultural, traditional reasons. Therefore, thus and because, my son, the auto electrician, cannot buy even watered down battery electrolyte without filling in a mountain of paperwork. Battery manufacturers are not allowed to ship batteries dry in Australia anymore. So when I decided to lay out $1,500 to buy 6 brand new batteries before Christmas, I was a bit worried, you know, like they're probably going to take a month to get here, but I can rescue a battery after a month, you know. I didn't want to get a battery that had spent 2 or definitely not 3 months in transit. But with COVID and borders and lockdowns and yada, 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 it wasn't until well after January, February that they started manufacturing batteries again. And there were delays and delays. And finally, last week, dropped into my son's workshop and he said, oh, your batteries will be here late this afternoon. While we were talking, his missus drives up. She's just been down to Armidale because another customer wanted 6 of the same batteries that I'm after because they were having them put in a bus. And there was a couple of other batteries to be picked up. And rather than stuff around waiting for the couriers to get their act together to shift these batteries 100 k's up the road, daughter-in-law goes down and ferries the batteries home. So it's sundown on a Friday and unload the batteries and put them in a neat line. And my understanding was that on Monday, 6 of them were going to go into the bus. I didn't think to ask for a multimeter and to prong all 12 units and to pick the litter and get the best out of them. Pick the eyes out of them. Oh, I'll have that one and I'll have that one and I'll have that one and I'll have... And these are the youngest batteries that have spent the least time in transit. Just didn't think of it. Thought about it the next day and I thought, oh, well, you know, I won't bring him up and hassle him about it. Got to town on Monday and there's only 6 batteries sitting on the floor of the shop because he's already done the job on the bus. And it didn't occur to him to prong the batteries and give the old man a mates rates deal because I guess I raised him to be honest, you know, not to give one person better treatment than another. So, okay, he's a nice bloke and I take potluck with me batteries. So I get them home. I didn't bother bringing them home on the Monday because I had other stuff in the car because reasons. Get them home on Wednesday night. The first thing I did before getting them out of the car was prong them with a multimeter. And 4 of them were between 633 and 6.33 volts and 6.35 volts. So that's where they are on the scale of things. And if we run ourselves up with a finger and across to here, 77.5% of their charge capacity. So they have sulfated 22.5% of their charge capacity between South Australia and my backyard. But meanwhile, these two, brand new $250 at per each, 6.05 volts and 6.04 volts, 12.09 between them. So they're literally down there in the shit oh dear level. 40% discharged. %, actually, because they're sitting on 58 rather than 60. So yesterday I began an emergency procedure to rescue them, and being me, I monitored them, and I also monitored the pyramid to get some idea of what was going on with it. And by the second page of observations, I got the format evolved to a point where it became a bit easier to work out. And in the day, I managed to put 10.95 amp hours into these things, but 40% of 225 amp hours, that means they need 90 amp hours. And those two little batteries down there, not gonna do the job. That's why I've still got them back onto the sun, so I could show this to you. At this rate, it'll take another 3 days with these panels just to get these two batteries back up to the same resting discharge level as these 4 of them. And then it would take another 5 days on that pair, 5 days on that pair, and 5 days on that pair. So you're still looking at another 3 weeks at the 2 amps that these two can put out between them. One could move to a petrol generator, but the 240 volt generator working a 12 volt battery charger, it's only good for about 4.5 amps. If I stick them straight in the pyramid, then this is capable of putting out, we'll see what it's doing now. It can do 5.1 amps, sometimes 5.6. Putting out 4.1 at the moment. So I guess my hut's going to have to run on this corroded old system for another day or two. Okay, so we'll have a look and see what we've got at the moment. 6.17. .16, which gives us 12.23. So now I'll just turn these around. And we'll see what a difference .19, 2.2 amps to the situation. Battery A, 6.24. Battery B, 6.24. Well, that's all very well and good, but I don't think I want to let these things go 3 weeks before they go into service. So let's see what else we got in the shed, which might be able to do the job. Well, well, well. Look at that there then. What have we here? We'll see how they like that there then. I suspect that might make a difference. There you go, 2.2, 2.23. Okay. Battery A, 6.3738. 6.36 for battery B, for a combined 12.75 volts. So I'll just undo them. And move them out of the way. And being extremely careful not to make a mess of the polarities, we now cut the expensive end off, strip the insulation, twist the core. Man, it doesn't want to twist. Mould the core around the terminal, place our washer, and retaining nut in place. Give the nut enough to lock it there. And we do the same for the other side. Noting down 6.25, 6.25, giving us 12.5 volts across the pair before we hook up the big bugger. Which is in fact so big that even face down on the grass, it's showing 0.8 of a amp. So it should be good when I flip the panel. Okay. There we go, that's about right. Now, let's see what it's reading. 9.45 amps. Six 6.65, 6.62. $13.27 volts. I make that. And now I just keep a bit of an eye on it while monitoring across the whole block. 9.6 amps. And then while Ra, Baal, Ashtoth, the sun god, performs an emergency rescue charge for my brand new batteries. And it turns out that this pair of batteries, which because of their watered down electrolyte at 1.265 specific gravity, losing 0.9% of the stored charge per day. So at the end of a day, they're 99.1. At the end of 2 days, they're 98.2. At the end of 3 days, they're 97.3. At the end of 4 days, they're 96.4. End of 5 days, 95.5% charged. Whereas the 4 best batteries, to get down to 77.6%, it took them 28 days to get here. Battery A, 60.2% charge, took 56 days. Battery B, at 57.6%, it took 61 days to get here. And that's absolutely bog standard garden variety normal. If I was really unlucky, they would have been 2 weeks older and so close to being unsalvageable that I would have been tempted to pursue a warranty claim. And I wouldn't want to do that because I bought them through my son. I'd rather not get involved in that sort of paperwork with my son. But it wasn't his fault. Under the existing federal and state government regulations and legislation pertaining to battery acid, it's not even really Century's fault. It's just that's how the system works. And if you want to get the best batteries, you better talk to your supplier and explain to them that you know all this, that you've watched Wardle Zonderlot's video and you are aware that the batteries are filled up and capped in South Australia and they are going to be sulfating at 0.9% of their rated or their stored capacity, because it doesn't matter what their rated capacity is. The sulfation rate depends on how much power is actually stored in the battery at the time, and it loses 0.9% per day until you get it and connect it to a charger. And if your battery's taken 2 months, 61 days to get from the factory to the consumer, then yeah, first thing you got to do is emergency recharge your batteries. And while the big panel is on the 2 worst batteries, what I'll do, probably after making another cup of coffee, is I'll take those 2 panels over there and I'll stick them 1 panel on each pair of the other batteries just to get their electrolyte working again after having had 29 days worth of rest, time in which to sulfate. And here's a funny thing, even though the current is still 12.6 amps, the voltage is coming down. That's because the charging process is knocking lead sulfate off the plates, letting it fall down into the sludge traps, and the more fresh lead surface is exposed to the electrolyte, the more of it can react, then the less tender the batteries are. And tenderness, I remind you, is a colloquial vernacular way of expressing the battery's resistance to being charged. Okay, so I've just jiggled them, and these are 6.33 each, and those are 6.31 each. So now they're labelled. C goes with D, E goes with F. So now we take the rinky-dinky, lovely, colour-coded, idiot-proof link-up cables that my son made up for me, and we gang them up into matching pairs, showing 12.61 volts and 12.64 volts, because it took them a month to get here. Meanwhile, this is putting out 9.41 amps. Probably current's dropped off a bit because the panel is warmer, and hot solar panels don't make as much power as cold solar panels. 6.64 volts, 6.63 volts, down to 13.27. So it's taken 125.6 watts going into it to bring it up to read just slightly over what a resting fully charged battery should be. 9.47 divided by 225. I'm only charging at 4.2% of the rated capacity of 225 amp hours of this 12 volt battery. And we rig these up, all connected. 0.99, 1.05, 1.06, 1.07, 0.9. That one's holding 12.68, 12.71. So they can safely be left to just sit there while I go over and monitor this pair, which is showing 13.265, 0.27 at 9.47 amps. Now, I might be a crazy mad scientist, and I may spend far too much time thinking about stuff that most normal people can't be bothered to pay any significant attention to. But it really does irritate me to think about how many people who don't know the little bit that I know about batteries go out there and pay top dollar for brand new batteries. They think they're paying for something that's going to be in this kind of a condition, fully charged when they get it because it's brand new, because it's got those little red plastic caps on the terminals to prove that nobody else has ever used their brand new battery before they get it. Between the insurance industry not wanting to pay out for the occasional idiot who gets told to go and fill the battery and pours battery acid into their eyeballs with bubbles, and the in-suck-ura-titty industry, who's terrified of the idea of somebody getting some high energy chemicals and maybe using it to do backyard chemistry and build themselves an improvised explosive device, and the migrant population who've come to Australia to throw acid in the face of a shrew, a wife who upsets them, doesn't meet their expectations. Between those three bunches of dickheads, the insurance companies, the suck-ura-titty industry, and the traditional cultural migrant acid throwers, because that's their preferred form of domestic violence. They don't just get drunk and punch their missus on a Saturday night. Oh no, they go and get some battery acid. And they probably put it in a glass jar and stick the glass jar in a pot of boiling water and concentrate the battery acid before they throw it at the face of whoever humiliated them by telling them their dick was too little. Because of that, people like me can't buy a new battery. We have to buy a pre-aged battery, and then we have to go into emergency rescue therapy to rescue our allegedly brand new century deep cycle industrial storage batteries with their reassuring, absolutely lying, worthless, useless, pointless, bullshit little red plastic caps to prove to you that nobody has ever tried to recharge your battery since it was filled. And that's why the miserable, mongrel, professionally paranoid bastards from the security industry and the insurance industry force the people at the battery industry, who used to provide new batteries all over the country, they're forced to provide pre-aged, pre-flattened, pre-damaged batteries, and they charge new prices for it, and they tell everybody how great they are because 60 or 70% of the batteries manufactured in Australia come from recycled sources. That is the kind of greenwash that's going on with 150-year-old lead acid technology. I'll leave you to imagine how much greenwash, horse shit and balderdash there is spread across the rest of the renewable energy industry. At every level, people are making bullshit compromises that mean that it's almost wasted time. $1,500 to get myself a brand new set of batteries that, if they hadn't been pre-aged, well, I'm 60, so 20 years time they should probably last me out. The fact that they've been pre-aged means that in 15 years time they'll be as bad as these ones are now. And with shit like that going on, being considered to be normal to 5 decimal places, is it any wonder that most of the people who do know what's going on have very, very, very little faith in the idea that humanity at this late stage is going to clean up its act and stop pretending to do shit that's going to improve the situation. Stop pretending to care, because the arseholes who made the regulations and the legislations that put me in a situation where I can only buy pre-aged, pre-damaged, pre-sulfated batteries for brand new prices a month or two after they leave the factory, they don't give a shit about the nature of reality. They really don't appreciate what they are doing. If you know what's going on, you are reduced to quoting Jesus of the Christ variety. Forgive them, they know not what they do. Because if they know what they're doing, somebody should kick them up the arse until their nose bleeds. 100% fully charged, 1.3 specific gravity, 13.2 volts for a 12 volt battery. If you want to use a 24 volt system, just double these figures along here. 10.5, that becomes 21 volts, 22 volts, 23 volts, 24 volts, 25 volts, 26.4 volts. But because your 12 volt battery, your 6 volt battery and your 24 volt battery, they're all made up of 2 volt cells, and each cell is good for 2.2 volts when fully charged at rest. There you go. Now you know. My camera's on its battery warning, so I'm going to have to call an end to this video, and I'll just sit here and keep on obsessively monitoring the batteries. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.